A poor black girl strikes a marriage deal with a millionaire to save her sick mother. But as desperation turns into true love, a web of secrets threatens to destroy everything. Will love prevail? Before we get into the story, comment below where, in the world you're watching from today, Faith Johnson stared at the hospital bill in her trembling hands, the numbers blurring through her tears. $100,000. The amount might as well have been $1 million. Her mother's heart condition was getting worse by the day, and their insurance had denied the life-saving surgery she needed. "Baby, stop worrying about me," Rose Johnson said from her hospital bed, her voice weak but still carrying that familiar warmth. "The Lord will provide." Faith forced a smile, but inside her heart was breaking. 3 jobs, waitressing at the Artuai, diner, cleaning offices at night, and weekend shifts at the grocery store, and she still couldn't make enough to save her mama. The south side of Chicago had never felt more suffocating. "Miss Johnson?" A nurse appeared at the door. "Dr. Williams needs to discuss your mother's latest test results." In the hallway, the doctor's expression told Faith everything before he even spoke. "Your mother's condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. Without the surgery, I'm afraid she has less than 2 months." Faith nodded mechanically, her mind already racing through impossible solutions. She'd tried everything. Loan applications, crowdfunding, even begging her mother's church for help. Nothing had worked. That evening, as Faith cleaned the offices at the prestigious Kingsley Enterprises building downtown, she overheard a conversation that would change her life forever. "Alex, you know grandfather's conditions," a woman's sharp voice carried through the crack in the conference room door. "If you're not married by his birthday next month, control of the company goes to Cousin Richard." "I'm aware, Bethany," a deep male voice responded, tension evident in every word. "But finding a wife in 4 weeks is hardly realistic." "Then make it realistic. Offer someone money, anyone. It just needs to last a year until the inheritance is secure. Grandfather's old-fashioned values shouldn't cost you $1 billion empire." Faith's hand froze on her cleaning cart. A year of marriage for money? The idea was crazy, wasn't it? The next morning, running on 0 sleep and pure desperation, Faith put on her best dress, a simple blue number she saved for church, and walked into the Kingsley Enterprises lobby. The security guard gave her a suspicious look, but she held her head high. "I need to see Alexander Kingsley," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, barely glancing up. "No, but..." Faith took a deep breath. "Tell him I have a business proposition about his grandfather's conditions." 20 minutes later, Faith found herself in a corner office larger than her entire apartment. Alexander Kingsley was everything the gossip magazines described: tall, impossibly handsome, with steel blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He stood by floor-to-ceiling windows, backlit by the Chicago skyline. "You have 5 minutes," he said coldly. Faith's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I know you need a wife to secure your inheritance. I need $100,000 for my mother's heart surgery. I'm proposing a business arrangement." Alex's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his icy demeanor. "You're offering to marry me?" "For 1 year," Faith specified. "I'll sign whatever contracts you need. I'll learn to fit into your world. I'll be the perfect wife in public. After the year is up, we get a quiet divorce, and you never have to see me again." He studied her for a long moment, and Faith fought the urge to fidget under his intense scrutiny. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm desperate," Faith answered honestly, "and desperate people can't afford to be dishonest." Alex walked to his desk and pressed an intercom button. "Janet, clear my schedule for the next hour." He turned back to Faith. "Sit down, Miss Johnson." "Faith Johnson." "Well, Miss Johnson, let's discuss terms." As Faith sank into the leather chair across from his desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil. But for her mother's life, she'd dance with the devil himself. The contract was drawn up within days. Faith's hands shook as she signed her name on the dotted line. The terms were clear. 1 year of marriage, $100,000 paid immediately for her mother's surgery. She must move into his penthouse. She must follow his rules about appearance and behavior. No physical intimacy. Complete discretion about the arrangement. Any breach would result in immediate termination and repayment. "The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Alex informed her, tucking the contract into a folder. "I've arranged for a personal stylist to meet you afterward. We have a charity gala in 3 days. Our first public appearance as a couple." Faith nodded. unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This was really happening. That night, as she sat by her mother's hospital bed, Faith struggled with how to explain her sudden engagement, but Rose Johnson had always seen right through her daughter. "Baby girl, what have you done?" she asked softly. Faith held her mother's hand, forcing back tears. "Whatever it takes to save you, Mama. Whatever it takes." As Faith left the hospital, that night, a sleek black car waited to take her to her new life. She climbed in, clutching her small bag of belongings, and watched her old world disappear in the rearview mirror. The south side faded away as they drove north, toward the glittering Gold Coast and a world she knew nothing about. In his penthouse office, Alex stared out at the city lights, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His sister Bethany's words echoed in his mind. "A black girl from the south side? Are you insane? This will never work." But he'd seen something in Faith Johnson's eyes, a strength and determination that matched his own. Whether that would be enough to pull off this charade remained to be seen. Little did either of them know that their carefully planned business arrangement was about to become far more complicated than they ever imagined. The morning after her mother's surgery, Faith sat in an elegant salon chair, barely recognizing her reflection. Alex's personal stylist, Marcus, circled her like an artist studying his canvas. "Darling, we have so much to work with," he said, running his fingers through her natural curls. "But Alexander Kingsley's fiancée needs to look the part." 6 hours later, Faith emerged with straightened hair falling past her shoulders, a designer wardrobe and a crash course in which fork to use at fancy dinners. Her feet ached from practicing in heels, and her head spun with rules about posture and proper conversation topics. "Remember," Marcus instructed, "you met Alex at a charity event 3 months ago. It was love at first sight. The quick engagement is because you two just couldn't wait to start your lives together." Faith nodded, repeating the story they'd crafted. But nothing had prepared her for actually living with Alexander Kingsley. The penthouse was bigger than her whole apartment building. Her new bedroom, separate from Alex's, of course, had a closet larger than her old living room. But the luxury felt like a beautiful prison. "There are rules," Alex told her over breakfast the next morning, not looking up from his newspaper. "No visitors without my approval. No talking to the press. No going to the south side without security. And absolutely no telling anyone the truth about us." "I know how to keep my mouth shut," Faith replied, trying to hide how much his coldness stung. "Good, because one wrong move could cost us everything." He finally looked at her, his eyes widening slightly. The morning light streaming through the windows made her new appearance even more striking. He quickly looked away. "The car will take you to visit your mother. Be back by 6. We have dinner with my grandfather tonight." At the hospital, Rose Johnson was recovering well from her surgery, but her eyes filled with tears when she saw her daughter. "Oh, baby," she whispered, "what have they done to you?" "It's just hair, Mama," Faith said, forcing a smile. "The surgery worked. That's all that matters." "Mr. Kingsley's secretary dropped off some papers earlier," Rose said carefully. "Insurance papers and a confidentiality agreement." Faith's heart sank. Of course Alex would cover all bases. "Mama, Don't," Rose interrupted. "Just promise me you know what you're doing." Before Faith could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Breaking news about our engagement just hit. Reporters likely heading to. Hospital car coming to get you now." She barely had time to kiss her mother goodbye before Alex's security team whisked her away. At the penthouse, Alex was pacing. "Change into something appropriate," he ordered. "We need to make a public appearance to control the story." 30 minutes later, they walked out of his building hand in hand, putting on a show for the waiting photographers. Faith's heart raced as Alex pulled her close, his arm around her waist. "Smile," he whispered in her ear, "like you're madly in love." It wasn't hard to look flustered with his face so close to hers. The cameras flashed as he brushed his lips against her cheek, playing the part of the smitten fiancé perfectly. But the real test came that evening at his grandfather's mansion. Walter Kingsley was an imposing figure despite his age, studying Faith from his wheelchair with sharp eyes. "So this is the woman who captured my grandson's heart?" he asked, his tone unreadable. Faith summoned every lesson Marcus had taught her. "I'm honored to meet you, Mr. Kingsley. Please call me Walter." He waved her closer. "Tell me, my dear, what first drew you to Alexander?" Faith felt Alex tense beside her. This was the moment their whole plan could unravel. But as she opened her mouth to recite their practiced story, she looked at Alex and saw something she hadn't noticed before. a tiny muscle twitching in his jaw, betraying his anxiety. "His loneliness," she answered truthfully. "Behind all his success and power, I saw a man who needed someone to see him for who he really is." The room fell silent. Alex's hand found hers, squeezing it hard. Walter Kingsley smiled for the first time. "Well said, my dear, well said indeed." But their triumph was short-lived. As they moved to the dining room, a commotion erupted in the foyer. "You can't be serious, Alex." A stunning blonde woman stormed in, her designer dress floating behind her like battle armor. "3 months ago, you were going to propose to me, and now you're engaged to Victoria," Alex said tensely. "This isn't the time." Faith's stomach dropped as she recognized Victoria Reynolds, Alex's ex-girlfriend and one of Chicago's most prominent socialites. "Oh, I think this is exactly the time," Victoria spat, turning to Faith with a cruel smile. "Did he tell you about us, honey? About our plans? About the baby I lost?" Faith felt the room spin. This wasn't in any of their preparations. "That's enough." Alex's voice cracked like a whip. "Security, escort Miss Reynolds out." As Victoria was led away, she called back, "This isn't over, Alex. Everyone will see this for the sham it is." Later that night, back at the penthouse, Faith finally asked the question burning in her mind. Was she telling the truth? About the baby? Alex stood at the windows, his back to her. "Victoria lost a pregnancy 2 years ago. She never told me about it until it was too late. She used it to try to manipulate me into marriage." He turned to face her. "I need a drink. Would you like one?" Faith nodded, and for the first time they sat together on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below them like fallen stars. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "About Victoria, about all of this." "Don't be," he replied, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "You handled my grandfather perfectly tonight. I should be thanking you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something shifted between them. Then Alex stood abruptly. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." Faith watched him disappear into his room, trying to ignore the way her skin still tingled where he'd held her hand. This was business, she reminded herself, just business. But as she lay in her luxurious bed that night, she couldn't help wondering, how do you keep your heart from getting involved in a business deal that requires you to act like you're in love? "You want me to what?" Faith stared at Alex across the breakfast table, sure she'd misheard him. "Take dancing lessons," he repeated, sliding a brochure across to her. "The annual Kingsley Foundation Gala is in 3 weeks. Everyone will expect us to dance." That's how Faith found herself in a private ballroom studio the next day, trying not to step on Alex's feet as they learned the waltz. The instructor, Madame Claire, clapped her hands in frustration. "No, no, you must feel each other. Move as one," she insisted. "Closer. Together." Alex pulled Faith tighter against him, his hand warm on her lower back. She caught the scent of his cologne and tried to ignore how her heart sped up. "Relax," he murmured near her ear. "Just follow my lead." Hour after hour, they practiced. Slowly, Faith began to feel the rhythm, to anticipate Alex's movements. When they finally completed a perfect waltz, she laughed with genuine joy. Alex smiled too, a real smile that transformed his whole face. "See?" Madame Claire said triumphantly. "Now you dance like lovers." The smile vanished from Alex's face. He stepped back quickly, checking his phone. "That's enough for today. The car will take you home, Faith. I have a meeting." But that evening, Faith discovered her dance lessons weren't the only surprise. A thick envelope waited on her bed. "What's this?" she asked when Alex came home. "You're starting classes at Chicago Business School next week," he said, loosening his tie. 3 nights a week if anyone asks. You're pursuing your MBA to help with the family business." Faith opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was an acceptance letter and a course schedule, but I never applied. "I pulled some strings." Alex poured himself a drink. "We need to make you more convincing as my fiancé. Education is part of that." "You mean I'm not good enough as I am?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Alex turned to her, frowning. "That's not what I—" "Save it," Faith cut him off. "I know exactly what you mean. Just like the new clothes, the straight hair, the fancy manners. I'm a project for you to fix." "You're being ridiculous," Alex snapped. "This is an opportunity most people would kill for. Most people aren't being bought and sold like property." The moment the words left her mouth, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Alex's face went completely still. "Is that what you think?" he asked quietly. That I bought you, didn't you? Faith's voice cracked. Isn't that exactly what this is? He moved closer, his eyes intense. You came to me with the proposal, remember? I'm simply trying to help you succeed in this world. Your world, you mean? Faith shot back. Because mine isn't good enough. They stood inches apart now, the air crackling with tension. Faith could see the muscle working in Alex's jaw, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Your mother's doctor called today, he said finally. Her recovery is exceeding expectations. She can go home next week. The abrupt change of subject threw Faith off balance. Thank you for telling me. The townhouse I bought for her in Hyde Park will be ready by then. You what? Faith gasped. We never discussed. The South Side isn't safe, and you know it, Alex interrupted. This way you can visit her easily, and she'll have good medical care nearby. Faith felt tears threatening. Why are you doing all this? It's what a real fiancé would do, he answered, but his eyes said something more. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then Alex's phone buzzed, shattering the tension. His face darkened as he read the message. Victoria's gone to the press. She's claiming our engagement is a fraud. Faith's blood ran cold. What do we do? We fight back. Alex was already dialing his PR team. Get dressed, something elegant. We're going out to dinner where we'll be seen. An hour later, they were seated at Chicago's most exclusive restaurant putting on a show. Alex held her hand across the table, stroked her palm with his thumb, leaned in close to whisper in her ear. Every gesture calculated for the photographers. They could see lurking outside. But when he brushed a lock of hair from her face, his touch lingered longer than necessary. When she laughed at something he said, her joy was genuine. When their eyes met over candlelight, the heat between them was real. You're very good at this, Faith murmured as they waited for dessert. So are you, he replied, his voice husky. Sometimes, I almost believe it myself. The next morning, their photo was splashed across every society page in Chicago. Kingsley Heir and New Love, the real deal, the headlines screamed. But it was the smaller story, buried on page 6, that caught Faith's eye. Sources close. To Victoria Reynolds raise questions about Kingsley engagement. Don't worry, Alex said, coming up behind her as she read. Victoria's just bitter. No one will believe. Her. What if they do? Faith turned to face him. What if... Her words were cut off by the arrival of Alex's sister, Bethany, who burst into the penthouse like a hurricane. Have you completely lost your mind? She waved a tablet in Alex's face. Taking her to Le Petit, dancing lessons, business school. If you're trying to convince people this isn't a sham, you're doing a terrible job. Bethany, Alex warned, but his sister was on a roll. Everyone can see what this really is, she spat, turning to Faith. A girl from the wrong side of the tracks, suddenly engaged to one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors. Please, what did you do? Google how to trap a rich man. Faith felt each word like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Alex stepped between them. That's enough, he growled. You're talking about my future wife. The conviction in his voice made both women stare at him in shock. Future wife? Bethany laughed bitterly. Oh, brother dear, you can't possibly be falling for this. Choose your next words very carefully. Alex's voice was deadly quiet. Because if you insult Faith again, sister or not, you'll be out of my life and the company faster than you can blink. Bethany's mouth snapped shut. She looked between them, understanding dawning in her eyes. Oh my God, she whispered. You actually care about her. The silence that followed was deafening. Faith felt like she couldn't breathe. Get out, Alex told his sister. When they were alone, he wouldn't meet Faith's eyes. I have meetings all day. Don't forget you have your first business class tonight. He was gone before she could respond, leaving Faith to wonder which was the bigger lie, their fake engagement, or their pretense that they weren't falling in love for real. Faith's first week of business school was harder than anything she'd ever done. After her evening classes, she'd come home to find Alex still working in his office, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking more human than usual. He'd started asking about her classes, actually listening to her answers. One night, struggling with her finance homework, she found herself outside his office door. Come in, he called when she knocked. His eyes softened when he saw her frustrated expression. Trouble with Professor Chen's class? How did you know? I had him for my MBA. Alex cleared a space on his desk. Show me. For the next 2 hours, he helped her understand financial models and market analysis. Faith found herself watching his hands as he wrote, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. You're smarter. than you give yourself credit for, he said when they finished. You just never had the opportunity before. Like everything else in my life now, Faith replied quietly. All these opportunities I never had, handed to me because I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. Alex put down his pen. Is that really what you think? That you don't deserve any of this? Before she could answer, his phone rang. Faith recognized his grandfather's number on the screen. Dinner tomorrow night, Alex announced after hanging up. He wants to discuss the wedding. The next evening at the Kingsley mansion, Walter was in rare form. June wedding at the lake house, he declared. Just like your parents had, Alexander. Faith saw Alex's face tighten at the mention of his parents. She'd noticed he never talked about them. Grandfather, perhaps we should, Alex started, but Walter cut him off. I want to see you married before I die, boy. My heart isn't getting any stronger. The guilt manipulation worked. Alex agreed to start wedding preparations immediately. On the drive home, Faith finally asked the question she'd been holding back. What happened to your parents? The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, car accident. I was 14. Father was drinking, lost control on Lakeshore Drive. Bethany and I went to live with grandfather. Without thinking, Faith reached over and took his hand. She expected him to pull away, but his fingers tightened around hers. The moment was shattered by Faith's phone ringing. It was the security team from her mother's new house. Ms. Johnson, your mother collapsed. The ambulance is taking her to Chicago Memorial. The next hours were a blur. Faith paced the hospital waiting room, while doctors ran tests. To her surprise, Alex stayed, making calls to ensure Rose got the best care. Blood pressure spike, the doctor finally explained. The new medication isn't working as well as we hoped. Faith felt her world spinning. But the surgery was supposed to fix. I'll have the top cardiac specialists review her case. Alex interrupted, his CEO voice in full effect. Money is no object. Later, when Rose was sleeping peacefully under new medication, Faith found Alex in the hospital chapel of all places. You didn't have to stay, she said softly. Yes, I did. He stood, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. Faith, The chapel door burst open. Victoria stood there, designer clothes clashing with the simple surroundings. Well, isn't this cozy? She sneered, phone in hand. Emergency hospital visit at midnight. The press will love this. This is my mother's room number on the admission form, Faith realized, seeing the paper in Victoria's other hand. How dare you? How dare I? Victoria laughed. How dare you, honey, playing the devoted daughter while gold-digging your way into the Kingsley family. At least I loved Alex for real. That's enough, Alex's voice echoed off the chapel walls. Security. But Faith had reached her breaking point. You want to talk about real? Fine. Yes, I made a deal to marry Alex. Yes, it started as a business arrangement, because my mother was dying, and I would have done anything to save her. But you know what wasn't part of the deal? Her voice cracked. Actually falling in love with him. The chapel fell silent. Faith realized what she'd just confessed and fled, her heels echoing on the hospital tiles. She made it to the parking garage before Alex caught up to her. Faith, wait! He grabbed her arm, spinning her to face him. Did you mean that? Does it matter? She tried to pull away. Victoria recorded everything. By morning, everyone will know the truth. I don't care about Victoria right now. His hands framed her face. Did you mean what you said about falling in love? Faith stopped fighting. Yes, she whispered. God help me. I did. I do. Alex's kiss took her completely by surprise. It was nothing like the chaste pecs they'd shared for photographers. This was real, desperate, full of everything they'd been holding back. When they finally broke apart, Alex rested his forehead against hers. I've been falling for you since the day you walked into my office and tried to bargain for your mother's life. But the contract, to hell with the contract. He kissed her again, softer this time. I want you as my wife for real, no more pretending. Faith's heart soared, then plummeted as reality crashed back. Victoria will keep her mouth shut if she knows what's good for her. Alex's eyes hardened. I have enough dirt on her family to bury them 10 times over. She won't risk it. Your grandfather needs to know the truth from us. Together. Faith trembled. He'll hate me. He'll understand love making people do desperate things. Alex smiled slightly. He married my grandmother when she was a waitress at his father's country club. The scandal almost ruined them, but they were married 40 years. I never knew that. There's a lot you don't know about my family. He took her hand. Let me show you. For real this time. They walked back to her mother's room together. hands linked, but at the door Alex stopped. "Faith?" His voice was hesitant. I never said it back. "In the chapel. I love you too." Inside the room, Rose Johnson opened her eyes, smiling at the sight of her daughter's tears of joy. She'd been right all along. The Lord did provide, just not in any way they could have expected. The morning papers carried no scandal, no exposed secrets. Victoria's recording never surfaced, but the peace wouldn't last long. "She's just biding her time," Bethany warned over breakfast at the penthouse. After witnessing Alex and Faith's genuine feelings for each other, she'd become their unlikely ally. "Victoria's like a snake, most dangerous when quiet." Faith barely heard her, distracted by the way Alex's hand rested on her knee under the table. Everything felt different now that they'd admitted their feelings. Simple touches, shared glances, all carried new meaning. "We need to tell grandfather," Alex said, squeezing Faith's knee gently, "before Victoria finds a way to twist the truth." That afternoon they drove to the Kingsley mansion. Faith's stomach churned with anxiety. "What if he cuts you off, gives everything to Richard?" "Then I'll start over," Alex replied simply. "With you." Walter Kingsley sat in his study, looking frailer than Faith remembered. Alex took her hand as they faced him. "Grandfather, we need to tell you something," Alex began, "about how Faith and I really met." "Stop," Walter held up a hand. "Before you continue, I have something to show you." He pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Send her in." The door opened, and Victoria swept in, triumph written all over her face. "Hello, darlings." Faith's blood ran cold. Behind Victoria came a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. "Meet Mr. Harrison, my family's attorney," Victoria purred. "He has something very interesting to share." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Kingsley, we have evidence that your grandson's engagement is fraudulent, a business arrangement designed to secure your inheritance." Faith felt Alex's hand tighten around hers. "We have the original contract," Victoria continued, clearly savoring the moment, "along with proof of the $100,000 payment." "Really, Alex? Buying a wife? How desperate." "That's enough." Walter's voice cut through the room like steel. "Victoria, your father still works with my company, doesn't he?" Victoria's smile faltered. "What does that? And your family's shipping business relies heavily on Kingsley contracts, correct?" "Mr. Kingsley," Victoria stammered, "I'm only trying to protect—" "Get out." Walter's eyes were cold. "If I ever see you near my family again, your father will be looking for new employment, and your family business will collapse within a month." Victoria fled, her lawyer scurrying after her. In the silence that followed, Walter turned to Alex and Faith. "Now then," he said quietly, "tell me the truth, all of it." They did. Faith spoke of her mother's illness, her desperation. Alex described Faith's brave proposition, how their pretense became real. When they finished, Walter was silent for a long moment. Then he began to laugh. "Oh, the irony," he wheezed, wiping his eyes. "So all this scheme to secure the inheritance, when I never intended to give it to Richard anyway." "What?" Alex stared at his grandfather. "The marriage condition was a test, boy, to see if you'd choose love or money." Walter's eyes twinkled. "I never expected both." "You knew?" Faith whispered. "All along?" "My dear, I've been in business 60 years. You think I can't spot a contract marriage?" He reached for her hand. "But I also saw how my grandson looked at you. That couldn't be faked." Relief flooded through Faith, but Walter wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "there will be conditions to my continued support." Alex tensed. "What conditions?" "First, you will marry for real. No more contracts, no more pretending." Walter smiled. "Second, Faith continues her business education, not to please society, but because she's got a mind for it." Faith blinked back tears. "There's more?" "Yes, most importantly," Walter's voice softened, "you'll both come to Sunday dinner every week. This old man doesn't have much time left, and he'd like to know his family." They left the mansion an hour later, emotionally drained, but happy. But their peace was short-lived. Alex's phone buzzed with breaking news. Kingsley heir's fiancé, dark past revealed. The article, clearly planted by Victoria, exposed Faith's struggling background, her mother's illness, even her old jobs. But the tone was cruel, painting her as a calculating gold digger. "I'm so sorry," Faith whispered, reading the vicious words. "This is exactly what you wanted to avoid." Alex threw the phone aside and pulled her close. "No, this is exactly what I needed." "What do you mean?" "All my life I've worried about image, about what people would think. I've lived in a cage of expectations. He cupped her face in his hands. You taught me that real love is worth any scandal. Faith's heart swelled, but worry still nagged. The business will survive. In fact, a slow smile spread across his face. I have an idea. The next morning, Alex called a press conference. Faith stood beside him as cameras flashed. Yes, Faith Johnson came from a modest background, Alex announced. She worked multiple jobs to support her sick mother, and that's exactly why I fell in love with her. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Faith Johnson Scholarship Fund. Every year we'll send 50 underprivileged students to business school because talent and determination shouldn't be limited by circumstance. Faith stared at him in shock. He smiled down at her. My fiancé taught me that, he continued, and I've never been prouder to have her by my side. The reporters erupted with questions, but Alex wasn't finished. To Faith's surprise, he got down on one knee right there. Faith Johnson, he said, pulling out a ring different from the one they'd used for show. Will you marry me? For real this time? Tears streamed down Faith's face as cameras flashed. Yes, she whispered, 1,000 times yes. The headlines the next day told a different story than Victoria had planned. Kingsley, heir and fiancé, turned scandal to scholarship. But Faith's favorite moment came later, in the quiet of their penthouse. Alex held her close as they swayed to soft music. No dance instructor needed this time. Why did you really start the scholarship? She asked. Because love shouldn't be limited by social class, he murmured against her hair. And because every time I look at you, I see all the other amazing people society overlooks. Faith lifted her face to his. I love you, Alexander Kingsley. I love you too, future Mrs. Kingsley. He grinned. Now, about that June wedding. Outside their window, Chicago's lights twinkled like stars, witnesses to a love story that began as a business deal, but became something far more precious. Proof that true love could bridge any divide. Wedding preparations took over the penthouse. Faith sat surrounded by sample invitations when Alex burst in, his face dark with anger. The Richardson deal is dead, he announced, loosening his tie with sharp movements. They pulled out this morning. What? Why? The Richardson merger had been in works for months. According to them, they're uncomfortable with the company's changing image. Alex's laugh was bitter. Translation, they don't approve of me marrying you. Faith's heart sank. Because I'm not from your world. Because they're racist, classist, dinosaurs. Alex knelt before her chair. And I don't want their business if that's how they think. But it wasn't just the Richardsons. Over the next weeks, more conservative clients distanced themselves from Kingsley Enterprises. The stock price began to drop. The board is nervous, Bethany reported during a family dinner. Richard is using this to make his move. Richard? Faith asked. Your cousin, the one grandfather passed over, Alex explained. He's been trying to take control of the company for years. Walter Kingsley waved away their concerns. Richard's always been a snake, but he's a stupid snake. But even Walter couldn't dismiss the next blow. Someone leaked photos of Faith's old apartment building in the South Side, her mother's hospital bills, even her old waitress uniform. Kingsley's charity case? The tabloids screamed. Faith found Alex in his home office at midnight, reviewing financial reports. Maybe we should postpone the wedding, she suggested quietly. Give things time to settle. Absolutely not. Alex didn't even look up. I won't let them win. The company is suffering because of me. The company is suffering because of prejudice. He finally met her eyes. And I won't sacrifice our happiness to appease bigots. But Faith could see the strain taking its toll. Alex worked longer hours, slept less. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. Then came the anonymous letter. Faith found it mixed in with the wedding RSVPs. Inside was a photo that made her blood freeze. Alex's father's wrecked car from the accident that killed his parents. A note was attached. Ask your fiancé what really happened that night. Ask him why he blames himself. When she showed Alex the letter, all color drained from his face. I was supposed to pick them up, he whispered, slumping onto the couch. They were at a charity event. I was supposed to be their designated driver, but I went to a party instead. If I had been there, Faith held him as the story poured out. How his father had insisted on driving drunk. How Alex had ignored his mother's calls. How he'd sworn never to put anything before family again. That's why the company means so much, he finished. It's all I have left of them. No, Faith said firmly. It's not all you have. You have me. You have us. The next day, Faith walked into the Kingsley Enterprises board meeting uninvited. Gasps and whispers followed her to the podium. "I know many of you think I'm destroying this company," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "That I'm not good enough for Alex or the Kingsley name." The room fell silent. "But let me tell you what I am. I'm a woman who worked 3 jobs to save her mother's life, who's acing her business classes despite never having the advantages your children had, who loves Alex Kingsley not for his money but for his heart." She met Richard's sneering face across the room. "And I'm not going anywhere, so you can either work with us to make this company even stronger, or you can step aside, because times are changing whether you like it or not." Faith walked out with her head high, praying her trembling knees wouldn't give out. She found Alex waiting in the hallway. "You heard? Every word." His eyes shone with pride and love. "And so did someone else." Around the corner came Monica Chen, CEO of the largest tech company on the West Coast. "Miss Johnson," Monica smiled, "or should I say, the future Mrs. Kingsley, I'd like to discuss a partnership, one that would make the Richardson deal look like pocket change." Later that night, as they celebrated the new deal, Faith noticed Alex looking thoughtful. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about the scholarship program," he said. "What if we made it bigger? What if we created a whole foundation focused on breaking down barriers in business?" Faith's heart swelled. "Using our story to help others. Using our love to change the world." He pulled her close. "Together." A week later, Faith visited her mother's new house. Rose was looking healthier than ever, tending to her garden. "I saw you on the business news," Rose said proudly, "standing up to those board members." "I was terrified," Faith admitted, "but you did it anyway." Rose patted her hand. "That's real strength, baby, and that's why Alex loves you." Faith touched the engagement ring on her finger. Not the original showpiece, but a simpler one Alex had chosen himself. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real." "Believe it." Rose's eyes twinkled. "Now about my mother of the bride dress." As Faith drove back to the penthouse, her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Need you. Crisis at office." She rushed to Kingsley Enterprises, only to find the conference room dark. Then music started, playing, their waltz song from those first dance lessons. Alex appeared in the doorway holding a single rose. "Dance with me?" "What's the crisis?" Faith asked, stepping into his arms. "Missing you." He twirled her around the room where they'd first faced the board together. "I realized something today." "What's that?" "Every challenge we face, every battle we fight, they're not obstacles to our happiness. They're proof of how strong we are together." Faith rested her head on his shoulder as they swayed. Outside the windows, the sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of hope. With just 2 weeks until the wedding, Faith should have been focused on final dress fittings and seating arrangements. Instead, she found herself staring at a mysterious envelope that had been slipped under their door. Inside was a photo that made her stomach turn. Victoria and Richard locked in an intimate embrace. But it was the date stamp that caught her eye. Just 3 days ago. "I thought you should know," read the anonymous note. "They've been planning this for months." Before Faith could decide what to do, Alex burst into the penthouse, his face ashen. "Turn on the news." The TV flickered to life, showing Richard at a press conference. Victoria stood beside him wearing a massive diamond ring. "It's with great concern that I announce my bid for control of Kingsley Enterprises," Richard was saying. "Recent decisions have put the company's future at risk. My fiancée, Victoria Reynolds, and I believe strong leadership is needed to restore stability." Faith's hands shook. "Fiancée? It gets worse." Alex's voice was tight. "They're claiming to have proof that my father's accident wasn't an accident at all." "What? They're suggesting grandfather was involved somehow, that he wanted control of the company and—" Alex couldn't finish. Faith's mind raced. "But that would mean that my grandfather orchestrated my parents' death." Alex laughed bitterly. "It's ridiculous, but the stock is already dropping. Investors are panicking." Faith remembered Walter's frail figure at Sunday dinner, how he always kept a photo of Alex's parents on his desk. "We have to stop them." "I don't know how." For the first time since she'd known him, Alex looked defeated. "If they can plant this kind of doubt—" Faith's phone buzzed, a text from Bethany. "Emergency. Meet me at the old lake house. Come alone." The Kingsley Lake House stood abandoned since Alex's parents died. Faith found Bethany in the dusty living room, holding a stack of old papers. "I found these in Mother's things after the accident," Bethany said without preamble. "I never showed them to Alex. It would have destroyed him." Faith's heart pounded as she read the letters. They were from Alex's mother to her best friend, describing her fears about her husband's drinking, about strange meetings with Richard's father, about money missing from company accounts. The accident happened the night after Mother confronted. "Father, about the missing money," Bethany whispered. "Richard's father was embezzling millions and Father found out. Does Walter know about this?" "No. Mother never told him. She was protecting Father's memory." Faith's mind spun. "So Richard's father might have been involved in their deaths?" Bethany's eyes were hard. The investigation was rushed. No one looked too closely at the brake lines. Faith felt sick. "We have to tell Alex." "Tell me what?" They spun to find Alex in the doorway, looking like a ghost in his old family home. The truth came out in painful pieces. Alex read his mother's letters in silence, his face growing darker with each page. "All these years," he whispered, "I blamed myself, while Richard's father—" A noise from the hallway made them all freeze. Victoria stepped into view, phone raised. "Well, isn't this cozy?" she smirked. "Secret meetings, hidden letters. The press will love this conspiracy theory." "It's not a theory." Walter Kingsley's voice boomed from behind her. He stood in the doorway, supported by his nurse, but radiating authority. "I've suspected for years but could never prove it." Victoria's smirk faltered. "Mr. Kingsley, my security team has been watching you and Richard," Walter continued, "including your meeting 3 days ago with Richard's father in Miami." "You can't prove anything," Victoria stammered. "Actually, we can." Faith pulled out her phone, showing the photos she'd received. "Anonymous source. Not so anonymous now, is it, Walter?" Walter's eyes twinkled. "I had to protect my family, even if they didn't know they needed protecting." Alex stared at his grandfather. "You knew all this time?" "I've spent years gathering evidence. Richard's father confessed everything last week, trying to save himself. The police are arresting him and Richard as we speak." Victoria tried to run, but security guards appeared to block her exit. "The recording of Richard's father's confession airs already with the press," Walter said, "along with proof of their embezzlement and their plot against our family. It's over." Later that night, back in the penthouse, Alex held Faith as she cried for all he'd lost and found. "I wasted so many years blaming myself," he murmured. "If you hadn't gotten that envelope, if Walter hadn't sent it," Faith corrected. At Alex's surprised look, she smiled. Who else would have known where to look? He made sure we'd find the truth together. Like everything else. Alex kissed her softly. "You know what this means?" "What?" "We can finally focus on our wedding." But peace wasn't quite theirs yet. The next morning, Faith opened the newspaper to find one last shock. "Victoria Reynolds claims to be carrying Kingsley heir." The headline stared up at her, black and bold, threatening everything they'd fought for. Alex found her crying over her coffee. When she showed him the paper, his face hardened. "Don't you dare believe this," he said fiercely. "It's impossible." "How can you be sure?" "Because I haven't been with Victoria in over 2 years. He took Faith's hands. "And because I love you. Only you." Faith wanted to believe him, but doubt nagged. "The timing is suspicious, yes. Almost like a desperate person's last attempt at revenge." He was right. Within days, medical records emerged showing Victoria had been on fertility treatments, trying to fake a pregnancy. Her scheme exposed, she fled to Europe, leaving behind a trail of lies and broken dreams. The weekend before the wedding, Faith visited her mother's garden. Rose was humming as she tended her roses, Alex's wedding gift to her. "You look troubled, baby," Rose said, patting the bench beside her. "Just thinking about everything that's happened." Faith sat, breathing in the flower-scented air. "It feels like a dream sometimes." "Life's funny that way," Rose smiled. "One minute you're cleaning offices, the next you're marrying a billionaire who loves you for exactly who you are." "Who would have thought?" "I did." Rose's eyes were wise. "The moment you told me about your deal with Alex, I knew God had a bigger plan. Real love can't be bought or sold. It can only grow where it's meant to." Faith hugged her mother, thankful for her wisdom and strength. As she drove home, she passed the hospital where it all began. On impulse, she stopped. Room 507 was occupied by a young patient now, but the night nurse recognized her from the society pages. "You know," the nurse said kindly, "we all wondered why Mr. Kingsley kept coming back to visit you after he woke. Up now we know." "What?" Faith stopped. "After he woke up?" "Oh yes, for weeks before your engagement was announced. He'd sit for hours, asking about the cleaning lady who read to him. Said your voice helped him find his way back." Faith drove, home in a daze. She found Alex in his office. "You never told me you remembered," she said from the doorway. He looked up, understanding in his eyes. "Not everything, just fragments, your voice, your kindness, the way you saw me as a person, not a bank account. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I fell in love with you twice." He stood, drawing her into his arms. "Once while I was lost in darkness and again in the light of day. How many people get that lucky?" Faith kissed him, knowing that tomorrow she would walk down the aisle not because of a contract or a business deal, but because true love had found them both when they least expected it. Outside, Chicago sparkled in the summer twilight, a city of dreams and second chances, where a poor girl's sacrifice had led to the greatest love story ever told in the glittering world of the wealthy elite. Dawn broke over Lake Michigan on the morning of the wedding. Faith stood at the window of the bridal suite in the Kingsley Lake House, watching the sun paint the water gold. In just a few hours, she would become Mrs. Alexander Kingsley. "Nervous?" Rose asked, adjusting her daughter's veil. "Not about marrying Alex," Faith replied, "just waiting for something to go wrong. It always does." As if on cue, Bethany burst into the room, her bridesmaid dress rustling. "We have a problem. Victoria's been spotted in town." Faith's stomach dropped. She wouldn't dare. "Security's on high alert," Bethany assured her. "She won't get within a mile of this place." But Faith couldn't shake her unease. The last time anyone had seen Victoria, she'd been boarding a plane to Europe, humiliated by the exposure of her fake pregnancy scheme. In the groom's suite, Alex straightened his bow tie, remembering another wedding day that never happened. The day of his accident, when he'd first heard Faith's voice reading to him in the hospital. "Your parents would be so proud," Walter said from his wheelchair by the window. "Not of the company or the money, but of the man you've become." Alex knelt beside his grandfather. "I wish they were here." "They are, boy." Walter patted his hand. "They are." The lake house grounds had been transformed into a fairy tale. White roses and lilies lined the path to a flower-covered arch by the water. 300 guests filled the white chairs, Chicago's elite mixed with Faith's old. Friends from the South Side. Then everything started going wrong. First, the wedding coordinator rushed in with news that the caterers were stuck in traffic after an accident on Lakeshore Drive. Then the flower girl, Alex's young cousin, came down with stomach flu. "It's fine," Faith kept saying. "As long as Alex and I are here, nothing else matters." But when her makeup artist failed to show up, even Faith's calm began to crack. "I'll do it," offered Monica Chen, who had become a close friend since their business partnership. "I learned from the best in Hong Kong." As Monica worked, Faith's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "He'll never go through with it. Once a gold digger, always a gold digger." Faith deleted Victoria's message, but her hands trembled. "Don't let her in your head," Monica said firmly. "That woman's just jealous because you got the one thing she couldn't buy, real love." The ceremony was scheduled for sunset. As the string quartet began to play, Faith took her mother's arm, ready to walk down the aisle. Then Bethany appeared, face pale. "Alex is gone." "What?" Faith's world tilted. "He went to his office an hour ago to get something. He's not answering his phone." Faith's mind raced. The office was an hour away. The sun was setting. Guests were waiting. "Give me your car keys," she told Bethany. "Faith, no, you can't leave. Your own wedding." "Watch me." Still in her wedding dress, Faith drove through Chicago traffic like a woman possessed. She found the Kingsley building dark except for the top floor. The security guard's eyes widened as she swept past in her white gown. "Miss Johnson, Mr. Kingsley is upstairs with—" Faith's heart stopped as the elevator opened on Alex's floor. Victoria's voice drifted from his office. "You know this is a mistake," she was saying. "What happens when the novelty wears off? When you get tired of explaining her to your business associates?" Faith's steps slowed. Through the gap in the door, she could see Alex standing by the windows where she'd first proposed their deal. "Are you finished?" His voice was cold. "Because I have a wedding to get to." "Alex, please." Victoria moved closer to him. "We make sense together. We come from the same world. That's exactly why we'd never work." Alex stepped back. "You see love as a business transaction. Faith taught me it's so much more. By starting with a business transaction." Victoria laughed bitterly. "By showing me that real love grows in the most unexpected places." Alex turned and saw Faith in the doorway. His whole face lit up. "Like right now." Victoria spun around. "How dare you? No, how dare you?" Faith's voice shook with anger. "You've tried everything to break us apart. Lies, schemes, Fake pregnancies. None of it worked. I know why? Because what Alex and I have is real. You don't belong in his world. You're right, Faith smiled. I don't belong in his world. He belongs in mine, where love matters more than money, where family means having each other's backs, and where happiness isn't measured by bank accounts. She held out her hand to Alex. Now I believe we have a wedding to get to. Alex took her hand, then paused. Just need to get one thing. He went to his desk and pulled out an old, worn book, The Little Prince. The book you read to me in the hospital, he explained. I wanted it with us when we say our vows. They left Victoria standing alone in the darkening office. The sun was just touching the lake when they made it back to the wedding. Their guests had waited, somehow knowing this story deserved its perfect ending. Rose cried as she finally walked her daughter down the aisle. Walter beamed from his place of honor. Bethany winked from her spot as maid of honor. Today's reading, the minister announced, is from The Little Prince. Alex opened the worn book, reading the words Faith had once read to him. What makes the desert beautiful is that somewhere it hides a well. Faith's voice joined his. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Their vows were simple, honest, true. No fancy words or elaborate promises, just two hearts that had found each other against all odds. I now pronounce you husband and wife. As Alex kissed her, Faith heard her mother whisper, "Thank you, Lord." The reception was a blur of joy. The delayed caterers arrived with even better food. The flower girl felt better and scattered rose petals everywhere. Someone's grandmother got up and sang an old love song that made everyone cry. Late that night, Faith and Alex swayed on the empty dance floor, her head on his shoulder. Happy, Mrs. Kingsley. Faith smiled. But you know what I'm happiest about? What's that? That contract we signed all those months ago? We fulfilled every term, except one. Alex raised an eyebrow. Which one? The no physical intimacy clause. Faith grinned wickedly. I say we break that one tonight. His laugh echoed across the lake as he swept her into his arms, carrying her toward their future. Above them, stars twinkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet. But Faith had learned that the real treasures in life weren't the ones that glittered. They were the ones that glowed, warm and steady in the heart. 6 months into their marriage, Faith sat in her office at the Kingsley Foundation, reviewing applications for their scholarship program. The wall behind her desk displayed her newly earned MBA diploma. She'd finished top of her class. Mrs. Kingsley? Her assistant poked her head in. Your mother's here. Rose Johnson entered, looking elegant in a designer suit that still couldn't hide her down-to-earth warmth. Since recovering from her surgery, she'd become the Foundation's community outreach director, using her natural ability to connect with people. Baby, have you seen the news? Rose asked, turning on the office TV. The screen showed Victoria and Richard being led into court in handcuffs. The headline read, Kingsley Conspiracy, Guilty Verdicts in Murder Plot. Alex's parents can rest in peace now, Faith said softly. As if summoned by his name, her husband appeared in the doorway. Even after 6 months of marriage, the sight of him still made her heart skip. Ready for lunch? He asked, then noticed the TV. Ah, justice at last. But there was something in his voice that made Faith look closer. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong exactly. He sat on the edge of her desk. Grandfather's doctors called. His heart is getting weaker. Faith's hand found his. Walter had become like a father to her, teaching her the intricacies of business with endless patience. He wants to see us, Alex continued. Says it's important. They found Walter in his study, looking frailer than ever, but with that familiar twinkle in his eye. Sit down, both of you. He gestured to the chairs before his desk. I've made a decision about the company's future. Alex tensed beside Faith. I'm stepping down as chairman, Walter announced, and I'm naming Faith as my successor. The silence was deafening. But I'm CEO, Alex said carefully. Naturally, I assumed you're brilliant at running the company day to day, Walter interrupted. But Faith has the vision we need for the future, the way she's grown the foundation, how she's modernized our corporate culture. Together, you two will be unstoppable. Faith found her voice. Walter, I don't know what to say. Say yes, he smiled. Show them all how far a girl from the South Side can go. Later that night, in their penthouse, Faith found Alex on the balcony. Are you angry? She asked quietly. He turned, pulling her into his arms. Proud, terrified, excited, but not angry. He kissed her forehead. Grandfather's right. You see things differently than I do. It's why we work so well together. but their happiness was about to face its biggest test. A month later, Faith was in a board meeting when a wave of nausea hit her. She'd been feeling off for weeks but had blamed stress. The doctor's confirmation sent her world spinning. Pregnant, with twins. She drove to her mother's house in a daze, remembering all the fertility issues in Alex's family. His mother had tried for years before having him and Bethany. Rose took one look at her daughter's face and knew. "Tell me." "I'm pregnant," Faith whispered, "but I haven't told Alex yet. What if losing the babies is what drove Victoria? Crazy. What if I lose them too?" "Oh, baby," Rose held her close. "You're not Victoria. And this isn't about the past. This is God's blessing on your love." Faith found Alex in his home office that night. "I need to tell you something." His face went pale as she spoke. Then, to her shock, he started to cry. "Twins?" he whispered, dropping to his knees before her. "Are you sure?" She nodded, tears falling. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" He laughed through his tears. "Faith, you've given me everything I never knew I wanted. Love, purpose, and now a family of our own." The next Sunday dinner at the mansion was special. Walter wept when they told him the news. "Your parents would be so proud," he told Alex. Then to Faith, "And you, my dear, have brought this family more joy than we ever deserved." But pregnancy with twins while running a major corporation proved challenging. Faith struggled with morning sickness and fatigue. One particularly rough day, she fell asleep during a major client meeting. Alex found her crying in her office afterward. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "I'm letting everyone down." "No," his voice was firm. "You're growing our children. Everything else can wait." That night he called an emergency board meeting. "My wife is carrying the next generation of Kingsleys," he announced. "For the next few months she'll be working from home. Anyone who has a problem with that can tender their resignation." Nobody did. The months passed. Faith's belly grew, and so did the foundation. They opened new scholarship programs, started a mentorship initiative, even launched a venture capital fund for underprivileged entrepreneurs. Then, one spring morning, Faith went into labor 2 weeks early. "Just like their mama," Rose laughed, "in the delivery room, always making a dramatic entrance." After 18 hours of labor, Faith gave birth to a boy and a girl. "What should we name them?" she asked Alex as they held their tiny miracles. He looked at his daughter, with her mother's warm brown skin and his blue eyes. "Rose," he said softly, "after the 2 strongest women I know." Faith smiled at their son, who had Alex's coloring but her curly hair. "Walter," she decided, "for the man who gave us his blessing when the world tried to tear us apart." Walter insisted on having the baby's christening at the lake house. As Faith watched Alex showing their children the lake where they'd been married, she felt a deep sense of peace. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Bethany asked, joining her on the porch. "Just thinking about that first day in Alex's office," Faith replied, "when I offered to marry him for my mother's surgery money. And now look at you," Bethany grinned. "Running his company, carrying his name, bearing his children. It's like a fairy tale." "Better," Faith corrected. "It's real." That evening, after the babies were asleep in their nursery, Faith found Alex in his study, looking at an old photo of his parents. "They would have adored you," he said as she wrapped her arms around him, "almost as much as I do." "I've been thinking," Faith said, "about that contract we signed, the 1-year marriage deal." He smiled. "I believe we've slightly exceeded the terms." "Just slightly." She kissed him softly. "Think we should draw up a new one?" He pulled her closer. "How about a lifetime contract instead?" From the nursery came the sound of a baby crying. Then another. "Duty calls, Mr. Kingsley." "After you, Mrs. Kingsley." As they walked down the hall together, Faith remembered something she'd read to Alex in the hospital so long ago. The most beautiful things in life cannot be seen or touched. They must be felt with the heart. Looking at her husband and their children, Faith knew she was living proof of those words. 5 years later. "And that's how Mommy and Daddy fell in love," Faith finished, closing The Little Prince as 5-year-old Rose and Walter looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Tell us about the hospital again," Rose begged. At 5, she was already showing Faith's determination. "Tomorrow, sweet pea." Faith tucked them in. "Daddy's waiting to say goodnight." Alex appeared in the doorway, his dark hair touched with distinguished silver at the temples. Time had only made him more handsome. "Papa Walter's coming tomorrow?" Walter asked hopefully, named for his great-grandfather, who had passed peacefully 2 years ago. "Yes, baby. The whole family's coming. For the Foundation's anniversary gala. After kisses and hugs, Faith and Alex walked hand in hand to their bedroom balcony, overlooking the city they'd helped transform. The Kingsley Foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams. What started as a scholarship program now included affordable housing initiatives, small business loans, and medical care programs, all inspired by their own love story. "Hard to believe it's been 6 years, Alex mused, pulling Faith close. "Since I walked into your office and proposed our deal." She smiled against his chest. "Best business decision I ever made." The next evening, the grand ballroom of the Kingsley building sparkled with lights and laughter. Hundreds gathered to celebrate the foundation's 5th anniversary. Rose Johnson, elegant as ever, worked the room like a natural, sharing stories with donors. Bethany, now the foundation's legal director, entertained the twins by the chocolate fountain. Faith stood at the podium, her heart full as she surveyed the crowd. Former scholarship recipients sat alongside Chicago's elite. Southside community leaders chatted with business moguls. "6 years ago, I was a cleaning lady in this very building," she began. The room fell silent. "Working 3 jobs to save my mother's life. Today I stand before you as chairman of Kingsley Enterprises and president of the Kingsley Foundation. But more importantly, I stand here as proof that love can transform lives." She caught Alex's eye in the crowd. "My husband and I started with a business contract, but God had a different contract in mind, one written not on paper, but on our hearts." The lights dimmed, and a video began playing. Images flashed across the screen. Faith and Alex's wedding, the twins' birth, Walter's final days surrounded by family, the foundation's first scholarship ceremony. Then came newer footage. Rose and Walter Jr. at their first day of kindergarten. Faith and Alex cutting ribbons at new community centers. Families receiving keys to their first homes through the foundation's housing program. "Today we've helped over 1,000 students get their degrees," Faith continued. "Built 500 affordable homes, funded 300 small businesses, but numbers don't tell the real story." She gestured to a young woman in the front. "Oh, Maria here was our first scholarship recipient. Today she runs our medical outreach program." Maria stood, beaming. "The foundation didn't just help me become a doctor. It showed me that dreams don't have income requirements." As more success stories were shared, Faith felt Alex's arms slip around her waist. "Proud of you, Mrs. Kingsley," he whispered. The evening ended with their traditional dance, the same waltz they'd learned 6 years ago. "Remember how terrible we were?" Faith laughed as they swayed. "I remember being terrified of holding you too close." Alex pulled her closer. "Now I never want to let go." Later that night, after the twins were asleep, Faith found Alex in his study. He was looking at an old photo, not of his parents this time, but of Faith in her cleaning uniform, taken by hospital security cameras the night they first met. "Sometimes I wonder," he said softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't been so brave that day? If you hadn't walked into my office and changed my life? I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in that accident," Faith replied. "If you hadn't heard my voice reading to you. I guess God writes better stories than we do." Faith touched the photo. "You know, the twins asked me today why I still keep my old uniform. What did you tell them?" "That it reminds me that love doesn't care about designer labels or bank accounts. It only cares about what's in your heart." Alex set down the photo and took her hands. "I have something to show you." He led her to their private elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. The building was dark and empty, but as they stepped out, Faith gasped. The marble lobby had been transformed. A new wall featured photographs of every family the foundation had helped, surrounding a larger image, Faith in her cleaning uniform, mopping this very floor. The plaque beneath it read, "The Kingsley Foundation, where love breaks all barriers." Dedicated to Faith Johnson Kingsley, who taught us that true worth isn't measured in dollars but in love. Tears streamed down Faith's face as she read the inscription. "Happy anniversary," Alex whispered, pulling out a small blue box. Inside was a heart-shaped locket. When she opened it, she found the original contract they'd signed, photographed and miniaturized. "To remind us where we started," Alex said, fastening it around her neck, "and how far love can take you." Faith touched the locket, then pulled her husband close. "Dance with me? Here? Now? Why not? This is where our story began." As they swayed in the darkness of the lobby where they'd first crossed paths, Faith remembered all the twists and turns that had led them here. The desperate deal, the fake engagement, the real love that had grown despite everything. "I love you, Alexander Kingsley," she whispered. "I love you too, Faith Johnson Kingsley." He kissed her softly. Contract or no contract, now and forever. Outside, Chicago's lights twinkled like stars, witnesses to a love story that had started with a business deal but had transformed into something far more precious. Proof that when love is real, it can break every barrier, bridge any divide, and turn the humblest beginnings into the most beautiful, happily ever after. The end.